The next demonstration I want to show you is called a mitered band or bias binding. It comes to a corner, inward or outward, and this one is top stitched on both edges. So we're going to first cut an inward corner, which I do by folding a diagonal and cutting straight. And then we'll use this for our outward corner. And I have some binding I've already made. I have a special tool that folds the edges in and presses them towards the center. It's a machine that it rolls through. And then I go to the iron and fold it in half again, like this, with one side slightly bigger than the other. It's slightly beyond the other one. It's not quite folded in the center. And there's a special reason for that. It makes it more perfect when you top stitch it. So my binding was cut 2 inches wide from the bias and then folded to become a 1/2 inch wide. And the first side that I will sew on is the short side. I want to open this out and use the seam allowance of the shorter side. And I might cut this here so I don't use the seam of the binding. And that's what we're going to start sewing on this inward corner. Okay, we're going to bind this corner with this binding, and I'm holding the side that was pressed a little smaller. I'm unfolding its seam allowance and lining them up in the at the raw edges. Now I will sew down the binding on the fold line. And I will stop at the seam allowance line of the corner before I get to the raw edge, and back tack right there. And you have to stop and remove it and start fresh. Then the next step is to fold. I open out the binding and fold it on a diagonal that goes right to the corner of the fabric, a 45-degree angle. So I'm folding my binding in a perfect L shape here. Now I'm going to bring it back over itself with a fold that matches the raw edge of the fabric. And I still have an L-shaped binding. Now my first stitching ended right here on this point where the 2 seam allowances would cross, and that's where I'm going to start my second stitching. Now that's ready to wrap it around the corner and create a nice diagonal miter. You'll fold all the edges in and fold them around the corner. And at this point it's actually helpful to press this back in shape. And I will probably also pin it. And when you're putting your seam allowance around the back, you want to create a diagonal miter just like the front has been created. So you fold all of it to one straight line and bring it neatly back again. And that's the goal, is to have a diagonal fold in the binding. Now all of this I want to wrap the edge with. So I'm going to put a pin holding my fold. And I think I need to go press this in so it can wrap around before I dare stitch it. It's okay. We'll start here. Okay, I've sewn my binding down 2 sides of the square. Now I'm going to press it in place and put the miter in this corner. First I press these seams nice and flat, and then I wrap the binding around them and press it in place. And we're going to do the same thing we did with the unfolded binding. Press first a diagonal fold and then bring it back on a diagonal and press the other side. And a minute ago I had pinned this corner in. Now I've pressed it in, and I'm going to pin it again so it stays in place. Now if you are doing a very elegant project and you don't want to see any stitching here, you might stitch this backing by hand. Or if it's something really thick, or if you think you might not be able to stay right on the line when we're sewing it from this side. Remember, we folded it so that this fold is a little beyond the seam line, so that if we're stitching with it as a guideline, it should still be caught. But sometimes that's tricky to have everything so straight that the back also gets caught when you stitch the front. But you can stitch that either as a top stitch a little ways from this edge, or if your backing comes farther over, you can stitch it in the ditch, in the line between the binding and the fabric, and it should still catch the back of the binding if it overlaps, if it underlaps just a little bit. In this case, again, I'm going to do it with a top stitching and show you the finished effect of that process. Top stitching should also be very close to the folded edge. Now remember, I have a pin under here holding the back of the binding. I'm going to make a pivot on this corner right on the miter. And now we'll check it and see if the back got caught. We're safe, and it did. So you have a neat little folded diagonal here and on the back, which I can stitch it shut, but I'd rather not because it's folded well and it's caught well in that stitching, so it doesn't come undone. If it were a very wide binding, you might want to stitch it shut, or it could maybe slide open. But that one's done.
Recording.
The inward corner to make a binding miter is very similar to a placket in that we're going to clip it right to the inward corner. Before I do that, I'm going to stay stitch it to that corner, which means stitching on the seam line in a corner shape just to reinforce it. Now I will be able to clip it diagonally right into the corner. I don't want to do that. I really want the binding up, but I don't have a small side. Okay. I'm going to line up the raw edges with the small side of my binding folded out and sew on its fold line. And that means I'll be sewing right to the corner that I just clipped to. And then, like we did in the placket, I'm going to open that clip and straighten out the seam line exactly straight. Even though it's an L-shaped cut, I just opened it. So I didn't stitch any tucks in it, but I did stitch with the L straight and opened it. So it looks like our placket did. Now I want to make my miter through that slit. I make the two folds just like we did in the outward curve. The first one is under here, it's a diagonal. The second one lines up with the seam line, and it brings all the fabric through the slit. All the binding through the slit in the fabric. Now I can fold the miter or the binding down on both sides and have the same miter as the front right here on the back. And pin that in. This will look nicer if we iron it again like we did on the first one. And iron the miter in with one diagonal on the other side and a straight line on this side. Then you wrap the binding around the seam, keeping your mitered fold right in the corner. If you want, you can pin some of these bindings down before you stitch them. I'm trying to be sure this covers that stay stitching I put in, but you could take it out if it's not covered. And now I'm ready to top stitch this down, and it will hold the back down as well. I'm going to give you an example of top stitching from the back side. And sometimes that's a risk that the front side doesn't look as good because you can't be positively sure where the folds are. But you do want, if it's a double-sided project, you want to be sure your fold is over the original seam line. And covering it. And that's my stay stitching there again. Right when you get to the corner, you can pivot and head the other direction. So that binding has has a nice mitered fold, and again, it wasn't quite caught on the front. I would move that stitching over, but it should all be very close to the edge.